was. Oh.
Your Bible's for Matthew 14th chapter. We'll start with the 22nd verse. It's an interesting chapter, this 14th chapter, as we will look through this. You know, a lot of times we struggle with faith. A lot of times we will feel like we're not saved, and the devil uses that. He uses our mind and tries to convince us, oh, if you were a Christian, you wouldn't have done that. If you were a Christian, you wouldn't have done that. And life throws stuff at us, and it also causes that. You know, this morning, the title of my message is Becoming a Water Walker. You know, it's something that in our faith that we want to be stronger. You know, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at what the altar was and how it's really not part of a lot of things that goes on, how the altar transformed our lives, and how that, you know, back in the day that, you know, if we had troubles, that we would be at the altar and we would, you know, we would pour our heart out to God. This morning, if you look at that 22nd verse, it says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. Now, when evening came, he was alone there, but the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, is it a ghost? And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, be of good cheer, it is I. Do not be afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on that water. So he said, come. And then Peter had come down out of the boat. He walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those who were in the boat came and worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Now, as I said, this 14th verse this 14th chapter, there's a lot of things going on in that 14th chapter. You know, you look at the very beginning of it, and you see John the beheaded, and then you see the feeding of the 5,000 that took place, and you know, just a little. We see a circumstantial account of the beheading of John the Baptist. 5,000 men, besides women and children, fed with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. The disciples take the ship, and Jesus stays behind and goes privately to the mountain to pray. You read that. We read that pretty regular, don't we? About Jesus withdrawing to the mountain to pray. You know, I wonder what Jesus prayed about. You ever think about that? You ever wonder what Jesus prayed? What Jesus' prayers were? I wish I knew. I know he prays for us. But the Bible tells us that he went to heaven, he sits on the right hand of the Father, and he intercedes on our behalf. Isn't that great? That Jesus, even in heaven, he thinks about us. But anyway, let's get back to our story. We see as Jesus went up to pray, and then suddenly, as the disciples get in the boat to head out, you know, there's all of a sudden, you know, there's a violent storm that arises by which the lives of the disciples are in danger. In their extremity, Jesus appears to them walking on the water. Jesus, at the command of the master, leaves the ship. You know, we look at that and we see all that taking place. Now, you know, Jesus had just spent the day feeding these 5,000 men. And there's no telling how many women and children. And they collected all the uneaten food. And then Jesus tells the disciples to get into the boat and go to the other side. I think sometimes we overlook at that. Because Jesus made the disciples go on that boat. Of course, now you stop to think, we are thinking this morning about how in our daily lives, how we can be like Peter and walk on water. That's what we're going to look at this morning. Now, we look at that, and the question is, what does it take to be a water walker? There's 5 things we're going to look at this morning. The very first thing is this: facing the storm, or faith building. The 24th verse says, "But the boat was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was against them." Tossed with waves, the grievously agitated, plunged under the waves, frequently covered with them. The waves often breaking over the vessel. The wind came rushing down from the mountains across there. And what we have to realize is this: that when we are serving God, when we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, when we're living that Christian life, when we're doing that, we will face storms. Now, I'm not talking about physical storms that are common in nature, but what we fail to realize in our Christian life is we are up against the principalities of the devil. There will be spiritual things that take place, just come in all of a sudden. But these storms of trials are difficult. Even sitting here today, there's probably some of us that's facing some of these storms. We have storms in life. Anyone who tells you that Christianity is smooth sailing really doesn't understand what the Bible teaches about serving the Lord. Remember, the disciples were in the storm because they were trying to be obedient to Christ. Remember, he told them to get in the boat and go to the other side. I wonder, it doesn't say that, but I wonder if that was his intention all along, to see how strong their faith was. That's a good question. Of course, I don't have the answer to that, do I? But what we see, that they were being obedient. Now, that's not the only reason storms come into life. The 22nd verse says, Jesus made the disciples get in the boat and go on the other side. And then they did so, or at least they tried to. 6 hours into this trip. Later, they had not made much progress. So we have to remember the very first thing is this: obedient water walkers will face storms. I guarantee you, if you live the Christian life, not try to, but if you live it, you're going to have storms. These storms we are up against, and when life is desperate, struggles within ourselves, within our circumstances, with our temptations, with our sorrows and our decisions. All of these things will be affected by that. At such a time, no man has to struggle alone, for Jesus comes to him across the storm of life with hands stretched out to save, and his calm, clear voice bidding us to be of good courage. That's one of the amazing things, that if we are a Christian, that we don't have to face life alone, because God will be with us. Christ is with us every day. The second in this becoming a water walker is this: recognize God's presence in the storm. He's there. There's not any situation in life that we will get in that God will not give us a way out. In that 25th and 27th verse, it says, in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, is it a ghost? They cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, be of good cheer. I am, do not fear. God approaches us. You just think, you're living your life, living your best life. You were just like a hellion. You were just doing everything you wanted to do. There was just everything was going on. You didn't have no care, so you thought. Then all of a sudden, somebody invited you to church. You never been to church before? Come in there and sit down. Kind of like it. The people were kind of nice, If you hit just the right day, jackpot day, there were you had some good food to eat. All of this takes place, and then You sit there and get along, and then all of a sudden, something happens to you. God will speak to your heart. And I would like to say that we're all real obedient at first, but you're not. Remember the struggle as Jesus, the conviction set in, and all of a sudden you felt the weight of the world on your shoulders, and then all of a sudden, before you do it, you let go of the pew and you walked down in front. Came down the altar and you gave your life to Christ. Most people will tell you, 99.9% will say, it felt like the weight of the world was lifted off my shoulders. And most of the time at that time, you share everybody what took place. And Jesus sought you out. I've seen people just out of the blue, and all of a sudden God had called them and touched their lives. And, and that's what happens. What Jesus said, he came to seek those that were lost, didn't he? He forsake the 99 to go get the one. Often in our own lives, we're tormented by waves of disappointment and doubt because in our mind, we didn't live up to those expectations that we had, and we were no better at recognizing his presence than they were. What we fail to realize is this. Now, these are the disciples of Jesus in this boat. They had been with Jesus day and night. They had just seen the things that took place. The beheading of John the Baptist. I'm sure that was a great discussion over there as the news traveled to them. But then, you see as that took place. But then, can you imagine what it'd be like? 5 fishes, 2 loaves of bread. Feed 7,000 people. That would be something. I'd like to see that, wouldn't you? I'd like to be a part of that. All of that took place. So here, and he tells them. I'm sure Jesus has told his disciples a lot. But he told them, he said, you get in the boat and go to the other side. I wonder if they thought, what's he up to? Because he's taught them all these lessons about faith, all these lessons about life, all these lessons about everything that's going to take place. And we find out sometimes in our own life that we're being obedient. We'll often say, God, I'm doing my best. Why do you let this happen to me? We've all said that one time or another. Jesus went to them. The Lord saw their troubles from his mountaintop and through the darkness of the light, for his heart was with them. But it was in the 4th night. You ask yourself, what was Jesus up to walking around on the water at 3 o'clock in the morning? Now, if you look at the book of Mark, the 6th chapter, the 48th verse tells us these words. It says, and he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary to them, and about the 4th watch of the night, he came toward them walking on the sea and would have passed them. That's interesting, isn't it? Now, but that's also very important as we're learning this. Mark told us that Jesus intended to pass them by on the water, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought it was a ghost. We asked the question, why did Jesus want to pass them by? And I contemplated on this a while. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Jesus wanted them to be able to trust him also in the storm. Let that soak in. In my life, it's not hard for me at all to trust Jesus when everything's going good. But when you get that phone call in the middle of the night, when you hear those circumstances, when you talk to people about their life, when you see all of that takes place, I can't help but think, the problem was, I don't think that they just got it. You know, God was visiting them while walking on water, but they couldn't see it. Matthew wants his readers to know that Jesus often comes when least expected. Whether it's at 3 o'clock in the morning walking on the water, or it's when you're in the hospital room praying for that sick one. It's whether you're on beside your bed because your marriage seems to go wrong. It's beside, when you're in that corner, when whole life seems to just be all messed up. You know, those are the times that Jesus is there. And you know, that's the thing, that when we fail to realize that he is right there waiting for us, there's not anything that happens in our life that Jesus is not aware of. These are divinely appointed defining moments. There's defining moments in our life that we have went to Christ with a concern and an earnest heart, no matter what time of day or night. But you know, these are moments that define things that happen in our lives. You know, and if we're not looking for Christ, then we just might miss him. And you know, we have to realize, you know, 12 disciples sat in the boat. And you know, all we know is these 12 that sat in there, and they were afraid. They were confused. You know, did they respond with wonder, disbelief, or perhaps maybe a little bit of each? Oh, but one. Listen. One, Peter was about to become a water walker. Why? Because he recognized that God was present, even in the most unlikely place. He realized that this was an extraordinary opportunity for spiritual adventure and growth. And God hears and responds to our cry. Instead of crying out to the Lord of fear, they should have cried to him for the situation that they were in. Because you remember, there's already a time when all he said was, "Peace, be still." And the water stopped. You said, but what does that have to do with this? It's very important. Sometimes God will calm the storm. Sometimes God will cause us. He'll calm us in the storm. We're going to face these storms. That's inevitable. It's going to happen. You know, God's response is he says, "I am." You know, which brings us to point number 3. You know, stepping out in faith from our boat. God will check our faith from time to time to see, make sure that we're growing it, to make sure that things are where they're supposed to be. Because we see it at 28th verse. It says that Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, tell me come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. You know, can you imagine what that would be? You know, to take Christ at his word, and we just allow our faith to transform into what he wants it to be. Because, you know, so many times when these storms hit into our life, so many times we worry about how we're going to do this, or we're worried about how to do that. But, you know, there's a phrase, and I know that you've heard it. We've all heard that. Let go and let God. Oh, those are easy words, aren't they? Till you get in those storms of life. And when you get in those storms of life, but just look at Peter's character. You know, to credit that, you know, Peter's character, he was impulsive and jumping on any exciting bandwagon which amused him. You remember in the Garden of Eden, he drew a sword and cut that serpent's ear off. You know, he often failed and came to grief. A great deal of Christian failure is due to acting upon an emotional moment without counting the cost. And we all are guilty of that. You know, Peter, he had less real faith than he supposed, and more eagerness than his faith would justify. You know, Peter never finally failed, for always in the moment of his failure, he clutched on to Christ. And the wonderful thing about Peter is that every time he fell, he rose again. And that must have been true even in his failures. That's the thing about us. We might fail, But failing to get back up is where we mess up. It's not no big deal to fall down, but just don't stay down. Peter's failures only made him to love Christ more and more. The more that Christ helps us, the more we will rely on him. Because what happened to Peter? Remember what Jesus called him? The rock. Upon this cornerstone I build my church. Put yourself in Peter's place for a minute. You have a sudden insight into what Jesus is doing. The Lord is passing by. Jesus is inviting you to go on an adventure of your life. Can you imagine that? The waves are high, the wind is strong. If you just close your eyes, you can just picture that as the waves are coming over the boat, and it's already said, those 12 disciples there, they're scared to death. Look out. Now, I know probably a lot of you don't deer hunt or something, but you can sit out there in the mornings right before daylight, and you can look, and there'll be the biggest buck standing just right out there. And it's just, if you stop, just let it get daylight enough where I can shoot. And then all of a sudden it gets light, and that great big buck that you've been watching for an hour turns out to be a tree limb. It does. And I mean, that's the thing. In our expectations, there will be things that we will focus on, but they won't really be what we're focused on. But you can close your eyes and you can picture that boat in those strong waves, the waves crashing, coming in, and we see all those disciples are scared. All right, so you're in Peter's place. See Jesus come walking. Peter already said, Lord, if it's you, call me. Jesus holds his hand up. He's coming. Every one of us has been at that place. If you've not been there, you will be there. Pray to be there. Just think. Adventure of your lifetime. So let's look at that. Two choices. The water or the boat. Now we have to realize the boat is safe and secure and it's comfortable, right? On the other hand, the water is rough. The waves are high, the wind is strong. There's a storm out there. If you get out of the boat, chances are you're going to survive. Whatever your boat happens to be, there's a good chance that you might sink. But, now listen to this. If you don't get out of the boat, there's a guaranteed certainty that you'll never walk on water. There's a lot of people that's right on the edge. Now, if you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. I believe there is something inside of us that tells us that there's more to life than just sitting in this boat. Because, the thing is, and that's what the Bible tells us, and we can imagine what that's like, is those 12 were sitting in there, that ferocious storm. And they're thinking that they're going to perish. And how do we know they're thinking that? Because we've already read another story where Jesus was asleep in the back. And in their minds they're thinking, does he not care if we perish? So we look at that. And we have to wonder, what's in your boat? Every one of us here are in that. Your boat is whatever represents safety and security to you apart from God himself. Your boat is whatever you are tempted to put your trust in, especially when life gets a little stormy. Your boat is whatever keeps you comfortable that you don't want to give it up. Even if it's keeping you from joining Jesus on the waves, your boat is whatever pulls you away from the high adventure of extreme discipleship. If you want to know what your boat is, you say, well, yeah, what is my boat? Your boat is what fears you most, what you fear most. There's not one of us sitting here today that doesn't have a fear in our life. It might be a vocation or relationship success or failures in our life. What areas in your life are you shrinking back from in this? And number 4 tells us this. Focus on God alone. But seeing that wind was strong, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, Ye of little faith, why do you doubt? You know, when he saw the boisterous winds, he was afraid. It was by faith in the power of Christ that he was upheld. When that faith failed and he began to sink, he stepped into the water, but the roaring winds and the rushing billows were too much for his faith. I think the story kind of goes like this. Peter was afraid. So Peter goes to the side of the boat. The other disciples are watching him closely. Don't you know that there's not a word uttered? The intense stare that they're watching Peter, the wonderment of it. You know, they've seen Peter shoot off his mouth before. They've seen Peter do all these other things before, but here now, this is serious. They wonder, how far will Peter take? You know? Will he do it? He puts one foot over the side, carefully gripping the edge of the boat. Then he puts the other foot over. And don't you know he's holding on that boat with dear life? Don't you know he is? Then he puts the other foot. For a while, it's as if Peter and Jesus are present on the water. Peter is beaming with delight. Jesus is thrilled with the student. It's like master and like disciple. And can you imagine as Peter let go of that boat and was walking on that water? Wasn't a doubt in his mind, was it? There was nothing but his faith and believing Christ. Invincible. Remember when you were first saved? You remember first when Jesus came into your heart and lifted all those burdens off, how you felt invincible? That's where Peter's at. Oh, then it happens. Peter saw the wind. Reality sets in, and Peter asked himself, what was I thinking? He realized that he was on the water in the middle of a storm with no boat beneath him, and he's terrified. Now, nothing has really changed, has it? You know, the storms shouldn't have been a surprise because, after all, he was in the midst of the storm. What really had taken place was that Peter's focus had shifted off of Jesus into the storm. What happens is when we go to Christ and we ask him to help us, to guide us through this storm in life, and Jesus does, he puts his hand on us, and he is taking care of us just like he said he would. Well, then all of a sudden we take our focus off him and we focus on our surroundings. That's what gets us when we leave Jesus, because that's what happened to Peter. When he did that, you know, and we're the same. We start something filled with hope, then reality sets in, opposition, unexpected obstacles. You see the wind, and it should be expected. But somehow trouble still has the power to catch us, and it surprises us. But you see, here's Peter walking on that water, and then all of a sudden he realizes where he's at, and he's thinking, what am I doing? But Peter faced a choice, as we all do, the choice to follow Jesus, which is the choice to grow, is a choice for the constant reoccurrence of fear. It'll happen. The more we follow Christ, the more things will happen in our life. Why is that? Because Satan is going to be against you every step of the way. But you have to get out of the boat every day. You know, here's the deep truth about being a water walker. The fear will never go away. Why? Because each time I want to grow, it will involve going into a new territory, taking on new challenges. And each time I do that, I will experience fear all over again. And he will do that. But you know, you realize that fear doesn't have the power to destroy you. The more you do that, the less you will pay attention to that voice telling you that you can't do that. So I ask you the question here. Did Peter fail? Some will say, well, yeah, he failed. He sank. Oh, listen. What about where's those other 11 at? They're still sitting in the boat. That's the thing. Every time, as a result of seeing the wind and giving into fear, Peter began to sink in the water. But we look at this. Like I said, I'll ask you the question, did Peter fail? Failure is not an event, but rather a judgment about an event. Failure is not something that happens to us or a label we attach things to. It's a way we think about the outcome. Now, keep that mind of failure in your mind. Did you know the example before Jonas Salk developed a vaccine for polio that finally worked? He tried 200 unsuccessful times. When Thomas Edison was branded a failure in his attempts to create a light bulb, he said, "I have not failed. I have just found 10,000 ways it didn't work." Before James Dyson invented the perfect vacuum cleaner, he went through 5,127 prototypes. You might be sitting here today thinking, man, you just don't know where I'm at. And you might be true. I don't know where you're at. It's not my business. But I'll tell you this, that you've got a God that loves you, a God that seeks you out, and it brings us to number 5, inviting Jesus into your life. The 32nd and 33rd verse, it says, "And when they had come into the boat, the wind ceased. And those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" Not a mere coincidence the wind ceased. But these verses finish with another great permanent truth, that when Jesus got into the boat, the wind sank. You're going to have storms in your life. That is guaranteed 100%. But the thing is, Christ has called us to be an overcomer. Overcomer. In other words, he's called us to be a water walker. To turn loose of that boat and to follow him. You might be sitting here this morning. You might be sitting in that boat thinking, well, I don't know. That's hard. I bought a boat one time, 17 foot, and walked through windshield, 70 horsepower Johnson motor on. We carried up there to Kentucky Lake. I backed that thing in, folded my family in there. We started out through there, and I went out a little bit, turned around, come right on back, put it on the boat, take it to the store, sold it. So,
You didn't tell about it stalled.
I didn't know. That's unimportant. Donnie's like, well, what's that? I said, listen, if I fall out of here, I said, there's no way I can drink all this water before I drink. That, the thing is that we get so caught up in being in the boat. The storms are blowing around us, the waves are crashing over. And in our mind, we think we're secure. But what happens in that storm, if those waves go in the boat enough, it's going to sink. Be the one that climbs out of the boat and walks on the water. Let Jesus, and no matter what storm you're in, take your life and take it where it needs to be. Yeah, you're going to have storms, but with him, he'll take you through it. So I'm going to ask as we stand with this audience doors come this morning. Father, we come before you this morning. We're thankful to be in your house. I'm thankful for these that have come out this morning. We just ask that as this time of invitation, that you'll speak with our hearts. You'll take us where we need to be. Father, maybe there's one